What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel. Okay, so I was originally going to do Dan Slott's Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, but what I decided to do was kind of wind the clock back a little bit. And instead, we're going to do a video on the origin of Antivenom. Now, the reason why we're doing this, and it's actually kind of like a fish out of water, doing the story, but the reason why we're doing this is because of the fact that there's like the third volume, I think, of Dan Slott's Amazing Spider-Man called The Return of Antivenom. And what I didn't want to do was try to cram the origin in with The Return of Antivenom, because it's like, hey guys, here's the return of a character that you don't know anything about. And so it's just kind of like, well, that's a problem. So I figured we'd go ahead and just kind of like do the origin. But the cool thing about this is that this really deals in a lot of ways with the reshuffling of Eddie Brock and even the Spider-Man mythos to a degree. It's really more about Eddie Brock than Spider-Man than Peter Parker, but the two kind of go hand in hand in terms of why it was done. And what I mean is following the events of One More Day, when Joe Quesada sat down and said, we need to basically take away everything that dates Peter Parker. That is to say, everything that makes him anything other than just like a kid trying to find his way in the world. Fans freaked, and they freaked for the same reason that, the pre-New 52 Wally West disappeared, things like that. When fans latch onto a character, they don't really like to see them change. But more so than that, a lot of people grew up with like the Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson relationship. And to suddenly see all that just tossed away because Peter Parker sold his soul to the devil so Aunt May could live for another 10 years really seemed just weird. And people just didn't like that at all. It was one of the most really reviled Spider-Man stories in the history of his character's publication history, if not in the history of comics in general. And so the result was that Spider-Man fans and the media, so on and so forth, everybody just kind of ran J. Michael Straczynski off the title. And the result was that the Spider-Man publications were basically run by a team of people. It was like Joe Quesada, kind of throwing his hands in the air and saying, who wants to write Spider-Man? And everybody was like, well, I do. And so he was like, then all of you guys come over here and we'll all just write stories. And this is where Dan Slott initially kind of got a start. It's really not until big time that Dan Slott officially took over the Spider-Man title on his own. But the fact remains here that with this whole reshuffling of the Peter Parker mythos, there were a lot of things that were being introduced, a lot of things that were being done. And that's kind of the beauty, the benefit of this story is, yeah, it is in the middle of everything, but it's in the middle of everything before anything's fleshed out. And so a lot of the characters that we're going to see popping up here haven't really had their origin stories explained yet. That didn't come, for another 10, 15, 20 issues after this particular publication. But the fact remains here that with Peter Parker, picking up with him, the cool thing is that we kind of get this, reminder of everything that's going on. That's what I wanted to touch on for a second. So, the whole origin of Peter Parker's timeless. A kid who's a science geek, bitten by a radioactive spider, gets the proportional strength of a spider, he has spider sense, so on and so forth. Spider-Man is born, becomes a hero after the death of Uncle Ben, all that kind of good stuff. But the idea is that there are also some characters that are being introduced. You have like Menace, for example. You have Mr. Negative, one half of a split personality between a guy named Martin Lee and, really a guy posing as Martin Lee and Mr. Negative. You have a few characters who are being introduced here and there. Of course, you've got your regular cast, so you have like Harry Osborne, so on and so forth. But what this does is it initially picks up with a conflict between Menace and Spider-Man. Now, this is one of the things that I was talking about where we're kind of in the middle of things, but none of this has really been fleshed out. Menace is a character who popped up before this story happened, but the origin of Menace had never really been explored. That didn't happen until Amazing Spider-Man 586, I think. And it turns out to be somebody that we're quite familiar with. But the idea here is that Menace is in a lot of ways kind of this reimagining of the Green Goblin, right? I mean, Norman Osborn is like an intrinsic villain of Spider-Man. Marvel Cinematic Universe is giving us Vulture. That's cool. We know it's only a matter of time before the Green Goblin shows up. You couldn't have Spider-Man in any film and not feature the Green Goblin somewhere along the line. That's just people kind of want to break from all the disastrous versions of the Green Goblin that we've gotten from Sony so far. But the idea here is that Menace really seems to be acting more like a vigilante, in the sense that Menace doesn't really have an adherence to like one particular person. It's just Menace kind of pops up and says, here are the things that I'm about, I'm about taking out Spider-Man, so on and so forth. But it's kind of this reminder where things stand. At the same time, there are also a lot of refugees who seem to have been brought into the United States for reasons that we're not really sure about, and they're just kind of escaping, taking up residence. They'll actually kind of wrap back around towards the end of the story. But again, this is just kind of a reminder of the direction that things are going in terms of Peter Parker, where he stands, what he's about. But this is when we start to get into the idea of Frontline. Now, prior to this, a guy by the name of Dexter Bennett had basically purchased the Daily Bugle. The problem with this is that instead of upholding the traditions of J. Jonah Jameson by keeping the Daily Bugle as a reputable news source, albeit a reputable news source that's slanted against Spider-Man, the fact remains that Dexter Bennett basically turned it into a tabloid magazine. It was like the National Enquirer, the Weekly World News. It was the lowest of any form of publication. And because of that, Peter Parker effectively left. Now, it was really more like, I guess, a firing than him actually leaving. thing, and the reason why was because of the fact that under, the leadership of Dexter Bennett, Peter Parker was basically transformed into a member of the paparazzi. But his actions in taking photographs of people, albeit not really wanting to do so, led to the deaths of one of the people that he was photographing. And so following that, realizing that his action was leading to the death of people, he basically vacated. Now, prior to this, Robbie Robertson had left, Sally Floyd, Ben Urich, they had all taken off to form Frontline. Now, of course, Frontline is a name you guys are probably familiar with regards to Civil War. Initially it started out as a blog, but it was transformed into a wholesale news company following the conclusion of Civil War. And what's also going on here is that Frontline itself, kind of picking up where J. Jonah Jameson's Daily Bugle left off after it was bought by Dexter Bennett, by considering itself to be a reputable news source. It's not focusing on the glitz and glamour tabloid stuff and focusing on actual important stories. Frontline is focusing on a guy by the name of Randall Crown. Now, the reason why they're focusing on Randall Crown is because he's a mayoral candidate. But the idea here is that he is involved in these individuals, that Spider-Man was dealing with, those individuals who were running off in the fight, all of whom appear to have been trafficked into the United States. And so the idea is that Randall Crown is working with some third party, we don't really know what it is, but he's working with some individual to traffic humans into the US for whatever the reason happens to be. But what we end up doing is we basically pick up with Norman Osborn's Thunderbolts. Now, this is when we start to get into the aftermath of Civil War. I mean, we've done Secret Invasion, right? Like, we talked about the Secret Invasion event. You can find that down in the description of this video. But Secret Invasion basically dealt with the aftermath, following the death of Captain America, following the main Civil War event itself. It was kind of Marvel bringing to a close this whole idea of the Superhuman Registration Act, and Secret Invasion concluded with Tony Stark being ousted as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Norman Osborn taking his place. And so because Norman Osborn took his place, Norman Osborn disbanded S.H.I.E.L.D., put Hammer in its place, and basically used the Thunderbolts as a way for him to begin going through and carrying out his own individual campaigns. Now, I know a lot of you guys are probably asking about Eddie Brock. A lot of you guys want to know what's going on with Eddie Brock. And so what we do is we transition to a place called Feast. And Feast is basically, it really stands for the idea of a food, emergency aid, shelter, and training. It's run by this guy named Mr. Lee for the purpose of grabbing individuals who are homeless, who have been displaced, whatever the case may be, and giving them the tools they need to get back on their feet and to find success. And so what happens is, I guess we basically find out that Aunt May is volunteering at this facility, but the entire basis behind this introduction comes by way of Betty Brant. Now, of course, the cool thing about Betty Brant is she's a longtime member of the Spider-Man mythos. I mean, she goes back, a long time. And in fact, she was the first romantic interest of Peter Parker before Gwen Stacy. I don't think it was really short-lived. It was really more of, Marvel kind of toying around with the idea before Gwen Stacy and Peter got together. But she's here because of the fact that Dexter Bennett basically says, look, I'm a supporter of Randall Crown. All right, this newspaper is basically going to serve as the media arm of Randall Crown. We're going to do everything we can to get him elected. If there's a publication out there that's posting information that basically contradicts the idea that Randall Crown is the best candidate, then your job, Betty Brant, is to go find information to discredit those individuals. In this instance, Bill Hollister. Bill Hollister is a guy who's basically running against Randall Crown, and what Dexter Bennett says is, go find a guy named Martin Lee. He's basically helping to fund the campaign of Bill Hollister. Your job is to report on him and to find dirt on that guy so we can use that to discredit Bill Hollister. We can say, well, Bill Hollister is being funded by a criminal, he's being funded by a guy who's involved in trafficking, whatever the case may be. Find information so that we can use it to discredit Hollister. And so with Betty Brant showing up here at the Feast facility, this is when we pick up with Eddie Brock. Now, the reason why I kind of waited until this point to talk about this, because I know a lot of you guys are kind of like, there was a lot going on with Eddie Brock. Yes, there was. Sal at Comic Pop and myself actually had this really cool conversation. I called him and asked him some questions about Eddie Brock because there were a few things that I was curious about, because I didn't really know how we got from A to B. I mean, I knew Eddie Brock was Venom. He was one of Spider-Man's most formidable villains. They were on again, off again allies. Eddie Brock had his own moral code, but I didn't know how we got from Eddie Brock being Venom to Eddie Brock basically being a cancer patient. And so when I was talking to Sal at Comic Pop, he had a really good statement where he basically said that following the events of One More Day, Marvel looked at Eddie Brock as like this holdover from the 1990s that just wasn't really relevant anymore. So what Marvel wanted to do was reshuffle the Venom concept around and see if they could shop it around to different characters and then finally find one that they could set on. So what they did is they basically passed the Venom symbiote from Eddie Brock to Matt Gargan, also known as Scorpion. And that's the reason why, if you guys see Venom as part of Thunderbolts, which you will see here, that's Scorpion. That's not actually Eddie Brock. That's why you're seeing, really Eddie and Venom in two different locations. But the idea here is that for the character of Eddie, Marvel did a lot of changing with regards to his origin, with regards to his backstory, and him suffering from cancer was the way in which they transitioned things. What Marvel did is with, I think it was Spectacular Spider-Man Volume 2, the first 5 issues composed a story called The Hunger. And what it basically said is where the original introduction of Venom established established that that Eddie Brock was a guy whose career was basically ruined by Peter Parker or by Spider-Man, and he bonded with the Venom symbiote for retribution. What Marvel does is they came back and said, no, that's not really the case. Instead, what happened was Eddie Brock had cancer, and the Venom symbiote bonded itself to Eddie Brock just for the simple fact that Eddie Brock's body was just pumping out chemicals like crazy, and it would keep the Venom symbiote going. And so in response to that, every time Eddie Brock went after Spider-Man, every time the two of them got into a conflict, Eddie Brock was acting on the defensive. He was terrified that if Spider-Man took the Venom symbiote away from him, it would result in him dying. Now, eventually what Marvel did is they came back between 2004 and 2007, and they started launching all these small little stories about Eddie Brock. There were about 2 or 3 of them. And what happened is Eddie Brock basically cast off the symbiote itself. He came to terms with the idea that he was going to die, and this basically picked up with him succumbing to his cancer, or at least appearing to succumb to his cancer, and falling into the process of dying. Now, again, this ties into the idea that Marvel was moving the Venom symbiote away from Eddie and putting it on Scorpion. But what happens is Eddie Brock basically travels to the Feast facility. He meets with Mr. Lee, and Mr. Lee basically cures him. Now, this is the other half of the Mr. Negative persona. It's one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to wait to this point to cover that. But the whole Mr. Negative, Mr. Lee dichotomy is kind of strange. That's fleshed out in a different origin. We don't really know too much about him, not for this story anyway. The only thing we really need to know is that Mr. Lee, the actual person that we're seeing here, is a guy that can heal people by touching them. When it comes to Mr. Negative, he's the other side of the coin. It's like this dichotomy between good and evil. Bruce Banner, the Incredible Hulk, that kind of thing. You know, it's this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde sort of situation. The face that we see here with Mr. Lee is the good side. But at this point, the way that Marvel's played this out, he doesn't know about the Mr. Negative persona. He just kind of switches over to it, and then Mr. Negative basically operates as a crime boss in Chinatown. But what happens is that where Mr. Lee had essentially touched Eddie Brock and cured him of his cancer, in this instance when Mr. Lee's talking to Betty Brant, and he's basically talking about how this place is considered to be a place of miracles, but how it's really, you know, God curing people, so on and so forth. When he touches Eddie Brock a second time, it reactivates the latent symbiote, Venom symbiote in his body. Now, what this does is this basically sets the stage for the introduction of Antivenom, for the idea of Eddie Brock going from normal Eddie Brock to becoming Antivenom. And the way this is done is actually really, really cool. It's one of these interesting things where it's like a million different things all going on at the same time. But with Peter Parker heading back, you know, going back to his residence, he's encountered by Norman Osborn. Now, the reason why is because at this moment right now, Spider-Man's essentially a fugitive. And the reason why Spider-Man's a fugitive is because Norman Osborn, with all his power, all his ability, has been trying to find a way to bring Spider-Man down. The problem with this is that Spider-Man is an Avenger. Spider-Man is one of the world's most celebrated heroes. The other thing you have to keep in mind here is that following the events of One More Day, and I think during the events of Brand New Day, I'm not going to swear to that, Peter Parker went to Doctor Strange and had Doctor Strange wipe the world's mind that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Of course, he revealed his identity during Civil War. That's why no one knows who he is, because Doctor Strange took care of that for him. And so the result is that Norman Osborn, all he really knows is that Peter Parker gets pictures of Spider-Man, the two of them seem to work together, and he wants to know where Spider-Man is. That's why Spider-Man's being framed, because Norman Osborn basically wants to make Spider-Man look like a murderer by going around killing people and then putting spider tracker devices on these dead bodies, so that anybody who covers a story, any forensic, scientist, whoever it is that analyzes these bodies, will come to the conclusion that Spider-Man killed them. Now, of course, we know Spider-Man didn't, but what this does is it allows Norman Osborn to kind of, show up in New York, show up in Manhattan, and begin the process of trying to find Peter Parker. Now, with Norman Osborn basically being forced to vacate the apartment because of the fact that, the roommate of Peter Parker, who at the time was a cop, was basically showing up, because of the fact that Norman Osborn didn't want to be seen as somebody who was caught abusing his power, because likely it would lead to him being removed as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. What ended up happening here is he basically takes off, and then Peter Parker as Spider-Man goes to see him in his base of operations, more or less to question him, to interrogate him, to find out what it is that he's doing. Because keep in mind, while Norman Osborn doesn't know that Peter Parker's Spider-Man, Peter Parker knows that Norman Osborn is the Green Goblin. And where Norman Osborn is putting on the front that he's a legit guy, where he's putting on the front to the world that he's a capable director of S.H.I.E.L.D., or I guess the director of Hammer at this point, Peter Parker knows it's only a matter of time before his nefarious deeds come to light. And so Peter Parker's half waiting it out, half looking for information to verify that Norman Osborn's a bad guy, because of course, we know that he is. But what Norman Osborn had also done is, in response to the idea that he had to leave Peter Parker's apartment early, he sent the rest of his Thunderbolts out, Songbird, Venom, so on and so forth, sent them all out and basically said, go find Spider-Man. Do whatever you need to do, but go find Spider-Man. Of course, not realizing that Spider-Man was going to show up on his doorstep. But what happened is the Venom symbiote was basically tracking down its previous host, tracking down the last host that it had. The issue with this is that one thing to keep in mind, the Venom symbiote has a mind of its own in a lot of ways. Not only that, Matt Gargan doesn't really know how to use it effectively. He's still still relatively new to the whole Venom concept, and so he's not nearly as adept or as used to Venom as Eddie Brock is. And the result is that the Venom symbiote is actually tracking down, or at least it seems like it's tracking down, Eddie Brock. And the reason why is because what it does is it smashes into the feast facility and encounters Eddie Brock with the intention of re-merging with him. The issue with this is that when the Venom symbiote accesses his body, it jumpstarts this latent, symbiote, these symbiote cells inside the body of Eddie Brock. And what he does is he emerges as Antivenom. Now, with regards to Marvel creating this standard, they had to find a way to differentiate the two, right? I mean, all the symbiotes have some aspect of them that make them unique, whether it's Toxin, basically the child of Carnage, whether it is, Venom itself, whether it is Carnage itself, whatever the case may be. A lot of the symbiotes have things that make them different, that make them unique. They share a lot of common traits, the immunity to Spider-Man, spider sense, the same sort of abilities that Spider-Man has, wall crawling, shooting webs, so on and so forth. For Antivenom, he's basically a guy, or at least the powers that Antivenom has are almost like a healing touch, so to speak, in the sense that, the abilities of Martin Lee were absorbed to some capacity or in some form or fashion. But what Antivenom has the ability to do is to basically touch the bodies of other people and cleanse them of impurities. And what this does is it gives Venom a weakness to Antivenom in the form that whenever Eddie Brock touches the Venom symbiote will start to recoil. It'll start to sort of go away because of the fact that it's literally being burned. It's like putting fire to your skin. And so what happens is Spider-Man, of course, shows up on the scene, realizing that that Venom's basically shown up at the feast facility where Aunt May works. And it's just like this three-way battle between the two. And it's actually really kind of cool to see. It's like Spider-Man versus Antivenom versus Venom. And it's awesome. I love things like this. I love the way these events, kind of coalesce, the way these little stories coalesce and begin to come together. But in the midst of this whole conflict, in the midst of all this madness, we suddenly have the Menace arriving. Now, of course, with the Menace showing up here, it's really for the purpose of grabbing Bill Hollister, carrying out its own goals, carrying out its own means. And so what we do is while, Menace basically takes off with Bill Hollister, or at least it seems like Menace is taking off with Bill Hollister, we have Spider-Man, Peter Parker, of course, planting his camera for the purpose of taking pictures so he can give them to Frontline and then engaging in the conflict. The funny thing about this is it's kind of like a mistake of identity, right? I mean, Peter Parker comes to realize that Antivenom is Eddie Brock, but in his mind, Eddie Brock is a bad guy. If Eddie Brock is wearing a symbiote, then it means Eddie Brock's gonna go do bad stuff. And this is a huge deal because, yeah, Cletus Cassidy was dangerous, but Eddie Brock knows how to fight Spider-Man in a way Carnage may never know. Now, of course, they're both equally dangerous, and in truth, I would go as far as to say that if we're talking about a direct fight, Peter Parker going against Carnage, Peter Parker going against Venom, it might be kind of a tough sell to tell me that Venom might get the upper hand, that in the end, Carnage would probably be the one to come out on top. But the idea here is that Peter Parker basically says, look, if you're Eddie Brock, then you must be a bad guy, but you're fighting Venom. So are you a bad guy? Is Peter Parker trying to get his bearings, trying to understand what's going on, but while this is happening, kind of staying out of the way at the same time? And so a really funny moment ends up happening here, when Peter Parker takes this philosophy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, when he tells, Antivenom, he's like, hey, you hate Venom, right? And Antivenom's like, yeah. And he's like, well, I hate him too. Let's team up. And then they basically team up against Venom and start taking him out. And it's really cool to see. It's really fun to see. But the issue with this is that, when Matt Gargan is basically cured, or at least it seems like he's cured of this Venom symbiote, where it's basically removed from his body, Antivenom basically turns his sights to Peter Parker. Now, the funny thing about this is he says, look, I can sense that you have issues, that your blood is not as pure as it needs to be. Part of this is because of the fact that at some point along the line, you were exposed to radioactive man. So you've got a little bit of radiation in your blood, but then he also realizes, oh, you've got a lot of radiation in your blood. Now, we know that that's how Peter Parker's powers function. Peter Parker has his abilities because his blood is irradiated. And so if Antivenom were to be able to go through with what it is that he's doing right now, which is basically purging the radiation from the blood of Peter Parker, he would lose all of his spider powers. And so it's kind of cool seeing this whole thing go on. The problem with this is that while all these events are unfolding, of course, when the cops had shown up, when Menace was trying to take Bill Hollister and Menace was forced to leave Bill Hollister behind, that Menace comes across Norman Osborn. Now, this is cool because this is kind of this return to familiarity with Norman Osborn, right? Like, there are moments in his character's publication history that are iconic. For example, the death of the Green Goblin. When Harry, I almost said when Harry Potter, when Norman Osborn and Peter Parker fought following the night Gwen Stacy died, that it resulted in Norman Osborn falling on his own sword, being impaled by his own glider. In a lot of ways, this bears some hallmarks to that particular fight, in the sense that Menace is using the various devices of Norman Osborne. Menace is, facing off against him, and the fight's very similar to the conflict between the two, and even Menace, Menace itself references the instance where Norman Osborn basically died against Peter Parker and says, hey, look, you were impaled on your own glider before. Let's see if we can do it again. Now, in the middle of this whole conflict with, between Peter Parker and Antivenom, the forces of the Thunderbolts arrive on the scene. And the reason why is because of the fact that Norman Osborn is like, look, guys, we gotta go. We gotta bail. The authorities are moving in here. We're making too much of a scene. We're supposed to be operating behind the scenes. No one's supposed to know that my hand is here. No one's supposed to catch my hand in the cookie jar. So he says, in order to keep that from happening, we gotta bail out. So he says, grab Matt Gargan. We'll get him out of here. And of course, the idea is grab Peter Parker or grab Spider-Man if he can as well. Of course, they're not able to. And Peter Parker essentially makes his escape. At the same time, it's Marvel setting the stage for the whole events, the whole situation with the future of Antivenom, in the sense that Antivenom kind of sits down for a second and says, okay, Spider-Man took off, I can go after Spider-Man or I can go after Venom. What Antivenom says is, I'm going to pursue Venom. My goal is going to be to take him out and remove the last vestiges of the Venom symbiote, those little cells or what have you, from the body of Scorpion, basically removing his ability to become Venom. And so because of this, with everything kind of wrapping up, Peter Parker travels back, checks on his Aunt May, makes sure that everything's all right. But then we also have Norman Osborn speaking directly to Randall Crown. And what we find out is that Norman Osborn and Randall Crown were essentially working together, in the sense that Randall Crown was trafficking people into the US by way of the various, cargo ships and so on and so forth that belonged to Norman Osborn. Of course, this was really, kind of a big deal. It was a very hush-hush thing for Osborn, just because of the fact that if it came to light that he was complicit in the trafficking of humans, it would bring down everything that he's worked so hard for. Because remember, what Norman Osborn's trying to do is basically take over the United States. We've talked about that before. We haven't really covered Dark Reign directly, but that was the whole basis of Dark Reign, was him trying to take over the United States, the Dark Avengers, the Dark X-Men, so on and so forth. It was him trying to conquer everything. And so what he does is he grabs the camera that Peter Parker had basically left behind, forgetting that it was there, and he starts showing the photos to the members of the Thunderbolts, and he says, there's a weakness here. There's a weakness here that we can exploit. And what he does is he says, whenever this camera's posted up, it's basically whoever Spider-Man is getting pictures for himself. And what he says is that inside the suit on the Spider is basically a tracking device, and the camera follows the Spider suit, which is how it is that it's always able to get these perfect shots. That's why the camera is just not taking shots of an empty road. It's actually following his physical body, and that's why he's always got his chest or his suit turned out to the camera so we can take pictures of him while he's moving. But what Norman Osborn says is, what we can do is we can basically tap into the frequency that this camera uses to follow the device in his chest, and we can in turn find a way to basically infiltrate Spider-Man's spider sense, to basically deceive it so he doesn't know that we're there. We can use that, to our own advantage, and then we can take him out from close quarters, from a distance. We can shoot him while he's going from building to building, and his spider sense will not alert him to what it is that's about to happen. Now, from here we find out that among the various soldiers that exist as part of Norman Osborn's regime is actually Antivenom. It's Eddie Brock, and this is when we learn that his suit basically allows him to shapeshift. It allows him to take on virtually any form that he wants to, and the result is that he's essentially infiltrating this. And the cool thing is that, again, Eddie Brock as Antivenom, is kind of like it's trying to be a hero. He's trying to be a good guy, and that's one of the things that makes him so unique. The problem with this is that after this story, I don't think he shows up again until the return of Antivenom. So it's kind of sad to see him only show up for a handful of comics. But the idea here is that he's essentially keeping tabs on everything that's going on, monitoring everything that's taking place. Now, with regards to Matt Gargan, with regards to Scorpion basically losing his ability to become Venom, it's not like the Venom symbiote is gone from his body in its entirety. It's still there. The issue is that it's basically been damaged to the point that it almost seems to be beyond repair. And so what happens is Radioactive Man basically begins to expose the body of Matt Gargan to radioactivity. And the reason why is because the goal is to basically take a blood sample and see if there's a way to essentially remove the antibodies basically that Antivenom puts out, to remove those from the body of Matt Gargan. And so what happens is Norman Osborn actually takes these chemicals and uses them on a guy named Freak. Now, Freak was originally introduced as a drug addict in the Amazing Spider-Man stories. That's really all he was. He's a character that was created as a means to an end. And what I mean by that is he appeared in a couple stories here and there, but this is by far the most notable role he played. Freak was basically a guy who grabbed just a random syringe, injected himself with the chemicals from Kirk Connors from the Lizard's lab, and then suddenly he developed the ability to basically adapt to any situation. He's not, he's not like a mutant or anything, and it's not an instantaneous thing. Instead, what happens is, he'll be burned alive, for example, and then his body will enter a chrysalis stage, and he'll come out immune to fire. And that's the way his body functions. It gets to the point where he just basically is immortal, like he can't be killed. And that's what Norman Osborn's banking on here. What he does is he takes the Antivenom compound, he injects it into the body of Freak with the intention of creating this super venom. And the purpose of having this super venom will basically be to kind of lay waste to things. You know, I mean, that's the danger of it, is that a few drops will ultimately end up killing people. And so what happens is Norman Osborn basically goes back to his lab for the purpose of using this chemical to engineer it, modify it a bit, and then jumpstart the powers of Matt Gargan, allowing him to become Venom again. The funny thing about this, though, is this is kind of like this resurgence of the Green Goblin. Not perfectly, not in the sense that like the Green Goblin has been gone forever. The Green Goblin's been around, but this is just another instance where he shows up. It's another instance of this sort of split situation in the mind and in the body of Norman Osborn. Now, from here, it's also, you know, again, Bullseye and the various members of the Thunderbolts carrying out the mission of Norman Osborn, basically finding Peter Parker, because, or at least finding Spider-Man, because again, they're basically using the frequency that the camera uses to access his device in his chest, to tap into his location, to basically use it like a homing device. And that's exactly what they do. You have Bullseye, you have a handful of soldiers that locate Spider-Man and track him down. The problem with this is that in the midst of their efforts to take out Spider-Man, the entire group is suddenly met with the arrival of Antivenom. And this is cool because Antivenom basically takes all these guys out. And it's interesting to see these two guys pair up because it turns into an actual team up, but it starts as like a weird situation that Spider-Man just doesn't really know how to work his mind around. I mean, he's used to Eddie Brock being a bad guy. He's used to Eddie Brock only working alongside him in certain situations. For example, the emergence of Carnage. And so because of that, the two of them actually working alongside, you know, working side by side as heroes. The idea of Antivenom saying, hey, look, you left your camera behind, they took it, and that's how they found you. You know, it's interesting. It's sort of a weird situation for Peter Parker. And so ultimately what happens is Antivenom and Parker are able to basically take out these various soldiers, knock out Bullseye, and then just bail out. Now, of course, we also have Matt Gargan being injected with the serum. The issue is that it's not an instantaneous thing. It'll take time for the Venom symbiote to come back, and the reason why is because the purpose of the serum is to basically burn out the anti-venom antibodies and allow the Venom symbiote to begin re-emerging. And so while it's in the process of doing that, Scorpion's basically given an updated Scorpion suit. And so again, this is Marvel kind of toying. This is Marvel going back and forth saying, hey guys, you know, you're getting the best of both. You're basically getting a side-by-side comparison. Here's a story where you see the Scorpion and you see the Scorpion as Venom in the exact same situations, in the exact same conflicts. Which one do you like more? Is really kind of what was going on here. And so the result is that we really get to kind of choose which one we enjoy, which one we don't enjoy. And so picking up with Spider-Man and picking up with Antivenom, the idea here is Antivenom basically says, hey, look, Norman Osborn, the Thunderbolts, the guys you're looking for, they all went back to the Osborn lab. They're all back there. You need to go to the Osborn research group if you want to track them down. And so it was kind of cool seeing these two guys work together, but we also see some really cool bit of ingenuity. The reason why this works so well and the reason why team-ups between Venom and Spider-Man have always worked is because it's like they're two sides of the same coin. You've got Spider-Man with his spider sense, you know, with his capabilities, his agility, strength, so on and so forth. And you've got Eddie Brock with his experience as part of Venom, you know, with the Venom symbiote. And so because of that, we basically have, you know, what looks like Spider-Man infiltrating the facility and being attacked by the Thunderbolts, only for us to find out that's not Spider-Man, that's actually Antivenom shapeshifted as Spider-Man. And so it's cool to see these things go against each other. It's cool to see them function. And so what happens is, of course, you know, Green Goblin makes his presence known. He and Spider-Man fight for a little while. It's kind of wrapping these things up by giving us a bit of fan service in terms of the characters, you know, fighting against one another. But we also find out that a lot of these people that have been brought in, a lot of these humans that have been trafficked, that have been kidnapped, were being experimented on. And so the question is, okay, you know, where's this road going to lead? Now, we're actually not going to find that out. We're not going to find out here where this road leads. Instead, what we do is we basically pick up with Scorpion, you know, again, continuing to fight against Antivenom, and then actually injecting him with a barb that basically seems to take away Eddie Brock's ability to be Venom. Instead, following this, we have Matt Gargan just re-invoking this Venom symbiote after it's finally healed and re-emerging, sort of going forward with the assumption that Antivenom is basically defeated, that he can't come back from this. And so during the entirety of this conflict, Norman Osborn had essentially activated a self-destruct in the building with the idea that the entire building was going to come crashing down, that everybody was going to be killed. Spider-Man was going to die, you know, of course, Freak still in that building was going to die. We know they made it out. But in the end, it's this idea that we're kind of left with a few unanswered questions in the sense of these individuals who are being experimented on, so on and so forth. But we're also left with the idea of Antivenom, you know, kind of focusing on Eddie Brock himself. In the end, he just sort of says, hey, look, you know, life gave me a second chance. Life gave me the opportunity to go forward and be a hero. hero. The question is, what am I going to do with this heroic role? What am I going to do with this situation? And so what he does, he basically, you know, his suit reactivates. He starts walking around shape-shifting, and then we don't really find out too much about what happens with him. I think he does, you know, a couple things here and there, but aside from that, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't really come back until the Return of Venom storyline as part of Dan Slott's Amazing Spider-Man. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explain, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, kind of a lengthy video. I will catch you guys later. Peace.